Hello, I'm David Gordon Koch with the NB Media Co-op. Joining me today is Chief Terry Richardson of Pabineau First Nation, also a board member with MTI, a group representing 9 Mi'kmaq communities in New Brunswick. Thanks for joining us today, Chief Richardson.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Dave. Appreciate it.
Now, the province has announced an additional 5,000 hectares of crown land available for maple producers over the next 5 years, and a press release from MTI recently described how MTI received details about this news on July 4th, just before the announcement. There was a few days notice the previous Friday, that was the Canada Day long weekend, that an announcement would be made. But other than that, from what I gather, not a lot of notice, if any, for MTI. Is that in a nutshell how things unfolded, or could you describe how MTI learned about this news?
That's perfectly described, Dave. I mean, I think when you look at consultation within this province of New Brunswick, and we look at lands in the province of New Brunswick, we're looking at unceded, unsurrendered lands. We're much like British Columbia, the same idea, the same model. I compare us. We've never sold our lands. We've never surrendered our lands. We've shared them under our peace and friendship treaties that have been in place since the 1700s. The problem we have is this government just doesn't get consultation. So, unless you're at the table negotiating and getting, they're still going through this process of forgetting about First Nations rights, which is going to cause a problem down the road because it's going to lead to litigation, unfortunately, I believe. And, whereas we could be sitting at a table and negotiating. And, you can go back to the way this province has dealt with First Nations right from the beginning of their mandate with the cancellation of, I realize this is not what we're talking about right now, but the cancellation of the tax agreement is an example of how they started off on the wrong foot with nothing to replace it. Now they've come up with, these, they call them economic development models. But again, it's a paternalistic approach of how First Nations are going to spend their money and where you got to spend it and how you're going to do it. Whereas, under the tax agreement, we had a lot of flexibility within that where we could spend it. And we've gone to the table and tried to negotiate with this province under the taxation agreement as an example, where we sat down, we said, here's a solution. Let's cap it, allow our First Nations to grow, and then we'll move on from there. Well, now we're dealing with here, all of a sudden we get there's going to be another 5,000 hectares of land assigned to maple syrup development without any consultation with First Nations. So what are we supposed to do? And then it's an afterthought. Oh, by the way, yeah, First Nations can come in and get involved if they like. But, the process should be engage the First Nations before this whole stuff started moving forward. And I believe that this government just doesn't understand how to do that.
Now, here's a quote from the government press release. It says, the provincial government is completing the duty to consult process with First Nations while seeking out interest in the expansion of maple sugaries. This consultation process will be completed before any final decisions are made. So this seems to suggest that consultation will be happening over the course of this expansion. So the government or its supporters would probably say, that's good enough. How would you respond?
I'd say no. The consultation should have happened before you move forward with these kind of announcements. It's almost like they're doing it backwards. I mean, this premier just doesn't understand consultation, and it's going to come at a cost to this province. I mean, right now, we've been very, First Nations have been trying to be accommodating and understanding, but there's stuff coming up that, maybe we start looking at it from a perspective of saying, I don't want to be combative either. I mean, there's a lot of development in my region that I want to see move forward. But if this province is not willing to sit at the table with these kind of things, do I even want to go sit at the table when they're looking at putting $50 million into SMNR technology? Maybe I say, well, you know what? Maybe I don't want to support SMNR technology because it's going to be in my traditional territory. So, these are things that the province doesn't get. And this premier doesn't get, unfortunately. And it's, again, litigation doesn't solve it. Litigation is you go to court. And you start with the New Brunswick courts, and then you go into the Supreme Court. Well, I'm very comfortable with being on unceded and unsurrendered territory in the province of New Brunswick to go to court, because I think the Supreme Court will find in our favor if the province is not going through the consultation process. And if consultation is one step, accommodation is the next step if need be. And I think in most cases it will, because we're talking about unceded, unsurrendered territory. So let's sit at a table and let's negotiate. It's interesting because the the developer of maple syrup within the province, he's willing, he wants to engage First Nations. He sees the opportunity. He said, yeah, I want to work with you. But he doesn't see how we got to this point of that, that 5,000 hectares coming there. Well, you should have engaged First Nations before you did that. I mean, any development in my territory, I would expect I want to be involved. I mean, if you're gonna cut my tax agreement and you're gonna take money away from me, well, I got to find other ways to make money. And being involved in development is one of those ways.
Now let's talk a little bit more about the historic dimension of this, which you referenced a moment ago, the peace and friendship treaties of the mid 1700s. And as many NB Media Co-op viewers or listeners will be aware, that the British historically signed these treaties with Indigenous people, including the Mi'kmaq people on the East Coast. And from a Government of Canada website here, it states that the British Crown first began entering into treaties to end hostilities and encourage cooperation between the British and First Nations. And even this Government of Canada website makes a distinction between those treaties, which and other historic treaties that involve First Nations ceding or surrendering their land. It says here, unlike later treaties signed in other parts of Canada, the peace and friendship treaties did not involve First Nations surrendering rights to the lands and resources that they traditionally used and occupied. And it's worth noting, I think, that Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution also recognizes and affirms treaty rights, including the peace and friendship treaties. So with this in mind, why are consultations important when it comes to the use of Crown lands, in your view?
Because we've never surrendered. We've never surrendered those lands. I mean, we've been here a lot, First Nations have been here a lot longer than anybody else. And when we accepted openly people coming, when we look at our relationship with the Acadians is very strong in this region, because when we look at expulsion of the Acadians, they came in, the Mi'kmaq helped them survive in many cases, and they experienced much what the First Nations experienced with the attempted genocide of their people and their culture. But I think the importance of this is that the government has to come and consult, because if you don't, then you're opening it up for litigation, and litigation costs money. It costs New Brunswick taxpayers money. It costs the First Nations money. And then most of the times when you get to the Supreme Court, in my understanding and what I've seen happen elsewhere in Canada and British Columbia specifically, because I go to British Columbia because they're very much like they've been unceded, unsurrendered territory as well. A lot of the other provinces have sold lands to the provinces. But in our case, we're unceded, unsurrendered. So the whole purpose there is to say, okay, well, if we're unceded and unsurrendered, then you should be negotiating with us. We are really the owners of the land. So let's talk about us benefiting as well. An elder in one of our communities, he put it into a perspective that's very simple. For so many years, we've watched the trucks drive by our communities, the big transport trucks hauling lumber, hauling minerals, and we never benefited from those opportunities. I can give an example in my region. When I look at Pabineau First Nation, Brunswick Mine was here, one of the largest mines, zinc mining companies in Canada. It was one of the largest deposits, operated for 30 years. Not one First Nation person retired from that mine. At the heyday, it was employing 1,000 people. We got no benefits, yet we're left with a big hole in the ground, and there's your benefit. So, these are the things that are concerning for First Nations. And all we're asking is a fair shake. That's what First Nations are asking for. They're saying, bring us to the table, leave us benefit as well, so that we can grow our economies. Poverty, Chief George Guinish will tell you that, 7 of the poorest postal codes in New Brunswick are in First Nation communities, known fact. So that tells you something. What's wrong with that picture? If these are the province is you got companies that are benefiting from the natural resources in the province, but First Nations aren't, and they're actually the rightful owners. So it's sort of like, how do we get this province to recognize that? How do we get them to understand that you should be at the table negotiating before you make decisions? And I really see it as only being litigation, unfortunately. And, I would prefer negotiation. I've done 25, before my time here I did 25 years in the military. I was in great spots like, the Gulf War in 91, Bosnia and Afghanistan twice. I would prefer negotiation than anything else. And it's very unfortunate. I was able to negotiate between warring factions when I was in Bosnia, between the Serbs and the Muslims. I look at that situation, able to get a bridge built between two communities, yet I come to the province of New Brunswick, I can't negotiate with the premier of our province. That tells me there's a problem somewhere.
Now, just going back to something you mentioned a moment ago, you referred to the developer. Just want to clarify. I think that you're referring to the association representing maple syrup producers.
Sorry.
Is that correct?
Sorry. I apologize. Yeah, the person in charge of the whole maple syrup organization, he sees the willingness and the openness and the benefit, believe it or not, of working with First Nations. And there is a benefit there.
Yeah, and I spoke to the president of that group. That group has pressured the government previously for more access to the land. When I spoke to him this morning, he emphasized that the association does not dispute Indigenous treaty rights. He said it's up to the courts to sort out those questions if negotiations between First Nations and government aren't successful. He said the group wants to work with First Nations, as you say, but noted that it's up to government to deal with these negotiations. So just your thoughts on industry and its part in this issue.
That's a good point. I think industry has a role to play. Obviously, if industry wants to grow, you have to have that relationship with First Nations. What I get a lot of, Dave, in our region is people coming in and they understand the importance of, the new buzzword is economic reconciliation in Canada. And that's allowing First Nations to benefit and stop becoming, I call it, a ward of the state. I would prefer to be making my own money and not relying on federal funding that I have to apply for on a yearly basis. And maybe I get what I need and what I don't get. I would prefer to make our own money in our community and then address all the needs I have. And then, I slowly get away from that funding and I don't need it anymore, And I think that's where we would like to head in our community, is down that road. But to do that, you have to be involved in economic development. And I think some proponents get it, developers, and some don't. I sort of think it's a cop-out to say it's, we'll leave the court sorted out. Well, if you want to wait, then you're going to be waiting an awful long time for your 5,000 hectares because that's going to stay in limbo until we go through the courts. And is that really the solution? And then the courts come back and say, well, we find in favor of the First Nations because it is their unceded, unsurrendered territory. Then where does that leave the developer back at? So why doesn't that organization come to First Nations, get rid of government? We don't even need government. Come and deal with First Nations. We're the rightful owners. Leave us have that fight with the government. That's what we tell proponents that come in. And most proponents say, I would rather deal with the First Nations than deal with the government, because you got a process-driven organization that just ties everything up and makes things long and lengthy. It doesn't get processed. It's easy for him to say, for the premier to say, well, yeah, we're gonna go through consultation. Well, if they don't go through consultation, guess what? We're in the courts. And what are the courts going to do? They're going to impose an injunction. There will be no development until this is rectified. So what does that solve? Nothing. And if it comes back and in most cases, I'm 99% sure and very confident that First Nations will win, because we're an unceded, unsurrendered territory. And there is already a responsibility for consultation. And if the government isn't following that, guess what? They're in fault. So, this is where we are with this government, and it's very unfortunate.
Now, in terms of the maple industry itself, I've seen some comments on online news articles about this issue. Some people arguing, well, maple production is rather low impact compared to some other resource industries in New Brunswick, such as forestry, for example, or shale gas extraction. And that leads to my next question, which is, do you have specific concerns about the effects of an expanded maple industry in New Brunswick?
Well, that's why you go engage in the consultation process, because what about our traditional hunting grounds? Is that going to limit our areas where we're allowed to harvest moose? Is that going to limit our access to medicines that we can't harvest anymore? These are questions we have to be answered. And if you're not engaging First Nations in the consultation process, right, then you're not getting the answers to those questions. So then we end up in litigation and we end up in court. Not a solution, I tell you. But, I think First Nations in this province right now are tired. I realize maple syrup is they may say it's a low impact, but you got to draw the line in the sand. And at some point, you got to say, this is the line, and we're done. We're not dealing with this anymore until this is brought forward. And, you know, there's always casualties in a war. And, you know, that's if they're looking at that perspective of going to war in this province, is if that's what they want, then so be it. Let's go to war and let's see where the chips fall. And I guarantee it won't be in favor of this provincial government, the PCs.
I always reach out to the government for to give them an opportunity to comment or for an interview for these stories. You know, and I think it's fair to say that this government has been quite combative on these issues of the relationship with First Nations. And of course, this discussion is all happening within the larger context of an ongoing land title case. Well, two major land title cases. Earlier this year, MTI asserted title for the Mi'kmaq nations to land and waters amounting to roughly half of the province in New Brunswick. And of course, there's a similar land title case ongoing in the western part of the province involving the Wolastoqey First Nations. And I think it bears mentioning that in October 2021, Attorney General Ted Fleming issued a memo banning civil servants in New Brunswick from making territorial land acknowledgements. At the time, of course, the provincial government cited the ongoing land title case with the Wolastoqey for that move. So with all this in mind, you know, as for the Mi'kmaq land title case, can you provide us with any update about how that is proceeding at this point?
Well, you know, the irony here is we're negotiating better between the Wolastoqey and the Mi'kmaq than with the province. With the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq, we have what we call a wampum belt ceremony, where we've actually sat down and we're starting to talk about the overlapping territory of both our traditional land claims. And the reason we're doing that is because the Wolastoqey, as you know, have a court case that is moving forward, and we're going down that road as well. I mean, you know, we tried to sit to negotiate with the province, don't want to sit and negotiate. I mean, you know, it comes down to, if you're not willing to sit and negotiate, then where are you headed? Why are we the only province in Canada that has a premier that doesn't understand what the consultation is? Every other province seems to be moving ahead. And you know the irony here, Dave, and I always tell people, take a look at every other province, why they're being successful. It's because of their relationship with First Nations. They're moving together, you know, and they're moving forward on the same front. This government doesn't get that. They just want to divide, and they divide us either by language, they divide us by culture, or they divide us by region in this province. That's not the way to get a province together and move it forward. You've got to move together forward as one. And that's where you're going to be successful, especially when we start looking at some of these big, huge projects we got coming forward in green energy. You know, I made a comment, you know, between PEI, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland, we don't have the same population as the city of Montreal. The city of Montreal is bigger than all of our populations of our four provinces together. Yet we're operating independently. We have an opportunity, and we're looking at this from a First Nation perspective. You know, we're thinking outside of the box. We're saying the province isn't going to do it. We're going to do it. If we were to work together as four provinces and say, you know what, we're going to develop and we're going to become the new green energy hub of the world. It's going to be Atlantic Canada, dealing with hydrogen, SMNR, wind, solar, carbon capture, tidal. I mean, we could be huge here if we work together. But these governments, again, you know, governments just don't get it. And it's too bad. And, you know, they divide people where they should be bringing people together. And I know up north, what we do is we work together with all our municipalities. We're working together with our developers. I'm willing to talk to this individual about opportunities for First Nations, but I got no phone call. MTI got no phone call. Well, you know, reach out. Don't even wait for the government. You reach out and say, here, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at accessing these lands for more maple development syrup. Let's look at working together in this aspect. What are your concerns from a First Nation perspective? So we talk. We start doing what we do what we call a Indigenous knowledge study, and we say, okay, this area was traditionally used for XXXX. These are our concerns. Is the development of maple syrup going to impact those concerns? No, well, you know, no, we can mitigate, we can do, no, there's things that can be done. So that's where you're talking, right? This is all part of the negotiation process. Then we sit down and we say, okay, how can First Nations get involved in this? What are the opportunities for First Nations so that, since it is traditional territory, unceded, unsurrendered, is being utilized, I'm all about sharing, but we've got to, give something back. And that's what we've been telling this premier from the beginning. And I can tell you, Dave, I sat one of my first meetings with Premier Higgs, and he said, well, I don't get consultation. That was from the premier of New Brunswick. I don't understand consultation. Well, if you don't understand it, then you're going to be in litigation at some point. And that's the unfortunate part. It fails me to understand how this premier does not understand what consultation is supposed to be. And if you don't understand it, then you're going to be in litigation. And again, I hate litigation, but I think this is the way it's going to be. And it's going to be at a cost to all New Brunswickers because of this premier.
We will reach out to the government to see if they if they have any comments on this to push the conversation forward. And I think that we've covered a lot of ground today in this discussion on Indigenous territory. Anything else to add briefly before we wrap up, Chief Richardson?
Yeah, sure, Dave. I appreciate the chance to just, again, together we're strong, divided we're weak. We have an opportunity in New Brunswick to do great things, but this premier's got to get his head out of the ground. Not stop being an ostrich, start looking at the real perspective of working together, and stop dividing this province, because that's not the solution.
Okay, well, we've been speaking to Chief Terry Richardson, Chief of Pabineau First Nation, and board member with MTI, the organization representing Mi'kmaq First Nations in New Brunswick. Thank you, Chief Richardson, for joining the NB Media Co-op today.
No problem, Dave. Anytime, my friend, and I appreciate the chance to discuss this. Thank you.